My headset works. I'm going to have to stay on speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Greg Byrne, and welcome. I'm here with Robert Robinson and Leanne Hausbeck from the Federal Practice Group here at the RAD headquarters in D.C., and we are here for our September 19th live Q&A session. So for this session, the first thing we're going to do is take about 15 or 20 minutes and go through the RAD inventory assessment tool. We've spruced it up a little bit, added a few more bells and whistles. For some PHAs, this is now a moot point because you're well past this stage, but for others who are still sort of planning their RAD conversions or looking at different properties, this still may be helpful to you. So we're going to do that, and just like in other Q&A sessions, you can either raise your hand electronically to so we can have you sort of orally ask a question, or you can send in written questions, and the instructions are shown there on the slide there. So without further ado, we're going to go to the new inventory tool, which has been, I believe, posted this afternoon on our website. And I'll double check later to see if that actually happened, but it's supposed to be posted. So what we're going to show you is now supposed to be up on it. It's now version 2.0. As with the earlier version of the tool, it still has sort of 4 tabs: a instructions tab, a global inputs tab, an inventory tab, and then a PHA list tab. And as always, we say it's not a bad idea to read the instructions to find out how this tool works. So we'll skip over that a little bit right now. We may come back to it later, but we'll go to the global inputs. So for this tab, if you remember last time, we only had about 4 or 6 entries that you had to make. And this, in the effort of both, on the one hand, simplicity, but on the other hand, some better precision, we've added a few more things on the global tab. So the first thing you do is you select it starts off blank, and you select your PHA. We're going to select WY015. It's the last one in there, which is Buffalo, Wyoming. And when we do it and we hit return, it says, yes, it's the city of Buffalo, and it has 2 amps. So that means, okay, that was who I wanted to do. So the next thing you do, as with the old one, is you click on the radio button that says populate data for all properties. It does it, and it goes sort of finds in the database, hidden in the tool, the two properties for this agency. You click on OK, and it brings us back to the main global inputs tab. Okay, so now, one of the main features of this new tool is that it actually starts off with a bunch of assumptions. Of course, you can change any assumption, and you don't have to do anything if you like all the assumptions to tell you whether RAD is a good candidate or not. But of course, some of these assumptions may not pan out, particularly what the rehab costs are. But essentially, it sort of starts with a set of assumptions that you can change. So those assumptions are, first of all, some of the income and expense assumptions: 3% vacancy loss, 2% bad debt, $120 per unit per annum, or $10 per unit per month in other income, and $500 replace reserve. So replace reserve is sort of a conservative number. You know that if you're doing a sort of a new tax credit project, depending on your state, it might be between $250 and $350 per unit per month. But most PHAs, you're not doing the construction, doing some rehab, and the actual replace reserve number is going to be a function of the physical condition assessment, but just as a beginning assumption, we throw in 500. Okay, so now the first mortgage financing terms, the first 4 items are all the same as they were before, which is an assumption, which is you enter interest rate, amortization term, MIP or mortgage insurance premium, as well as debt coverage ratio, except we started with 4. We believe that all the assumptions we put in this table are quote-unquote reasonable. It may not be appropriate for your local circumstance, so you should always sort of check every one of our assumptions, but we wouldn't have put in these numbers if we didn't think in many markets that they are sort of close to what today's environment is. So today, if you were to get an FHA 223F loan, it's very reasonable in most markets. You can get one at 4.25%, so that's why we sort of started off with that. But the one I haven't explained yet is the line 21, which is a new feature, which is first mortgage sizing criteria. And we gave you 2 choices. It starts with debt service coverage ratio, and the other is loan to value. So depending on the loan product you use, that most of the FHA loan products, and particularly the 221D4 loan product, is really are primarily about, or 221D4, but primarily about sort of debt service coverage ratio. So it tells you the maximum loan you could come up with. But other ways of sizing the loan could be loan to value, and so we added that as an opportunity for you. So if you click on loan to value, which Leanne just did, then the next thing it's going to need in order to come up with what's the loan value, it's going to ask you for two things, which is what's the cap rate for the particular project and what's the maximum loan. Once you come up with the value for the project, what's the maximum amount of loan that associated with that value. So we started with a cap rate of 7%. So today will not be a lesson in cap rates because, one, I'd probably botch it, but two, we don't have the time for it. But there's a lot of debate sort of on our team and other teams about, for a RAD or a Section 8 project, what's an appropriate cap rate? And you'll hear from many different camps, people sort of saying, well, it's 6%, it's 7%, it's 8%, it's 9%. Any one of those numbers, based on the circumstances, are probably right. Anyway, these are sort of beginning assumption, but we think that in many deals that 7% is probably in the zone, but don't take our word at it. The key here is to use this for planning purposes and to then have conversations with your lenders and investors about what an appropriate cap rate is if you're doing loan to value. So Leanne, let's go back and change it back to debt service coverage. Okay. So obviously, anytime you change any of these on the global page, it's automatically changing things on the inventory tab. Okay, so then you can convert to PBV or PBRA. That doesn't change. We had that before. But we added a few changes here in the initial operating expense assumption. You have four choices. You can do no global input, which means that you're just going to wait till you get to the inventory tab and put in the amount that you think is appropriate for every project. You can put your own market estimate if you think that you know what the number is. So Leanne will click on that. And let's say it's $4,500 per unit per year. That's what you know in this market is solid for what it should cost to run real estate. You can put that. Or choose not to do that, and we gave you two other options. So like before, we gave you 95% of the formula. This is the 2012 operating fund formula expenses for that PHA. Or you could choose 85%. So we gave you so we didn't give you an unlimited number. We gave you two choices. 95 is pretty conservative. We put in 85 because, as you've heard us present on other occasions, that the bulk of our PHAs who come in under RAD really believe that they'll be able to operate their properties for less than their formula expenses for various reasons, either because the property will be more efficient or because the regulatory structure will be less burdensome, or because today they happen to be running for less than the operating fund formula tells them they should operate for, and they'll expect to continue to do that. So we'll choose 85 here for a minute because, indeed, the experience of our RAD awardees seems to be closer to that range. Then we have the estimated hard costs. We just start off with a number here of $18,000, and this is just hard costs. You'll see later in the tool that it takes the hard cost and it sort of uses some assumptions about therefore what would be a contingency and all that. So you have to just decide how you want to use the tool and what your numbers are. If you know what it's going to cost to run your properties and it's an all-in number, then you might want to discount it for this. Or but if you know kind of what your hard number is, then just put the hard number in here. We just did 18,000. 18,000. Once you add other things like contingency and all that, is about what the app needs study said that the average backlog in public housing is. So, again, it's not perfect. We just sort of used the beginning assumption of 18,000. This is clearly one of the ones you want to change on your own because we clearly don't know what the needs are in any particular property around the country. And then estimated relocation cost. Actually, I think we should have started off with 0 on there, and let's put 0 because most projects are not going to have relocation, and so we'll start with 0. I did mention that in addition to Leanne and Robert on the call with me now, Jay Wright from C. Ray Baker and Associates, who's helped us build and revise this tool, is on the call. And Jay, just let's make a note to go back to that relocation item after the call. Okay, so we got 0 there. And so in most cases, you'd be done with your global assumptions. But there are some projects where PHA might want to consider either 4% or 9% credits. So we make it easier for you to model what would happen and how much debt, how much equity you could raise. So if you put on the toggle yes, we'll do yes here, then it gives you a bunch of other assumptions that are important for tax credit financing purposes. So what's the pricing assumption? Are you going to do 4% or 9%? So we can toggle there between 4 and 9, just see what happens with 9. So we can do there and 9. We'll go back to 4. And then if it's 4%, what's the current rate for 4% bonds? What's the rate for 9%? The percentage of value allocated to the building, because some of the credits are based on building. You don't get value for the land. What's going to be the developer fee as a percentage of cost, and how much of the developer fee you're going to defer. A lot of nonprofit or affordable housing projects end up deferring a portion of the fee in order to sort of make the deal work. Again, all of these are assumptions you can change, but just sort of starting out what do you want to do. And then if you've changed any of the assumptions and you want to go back to our beginning one, we won't do it, but it says you can restore all the global defaults, and you can sort of click on there and go back to the ones we started, but we won't click on that yet. But Leanne, let's go back to the row 35 and just go back to no tax credits for a moment. So anyway, so if it's no tax credits, we're going to assume that this particular agency is trying to make the numbers work without having to use credit. So we've done the global assumptions. We'll now go to the inventory tab. And what it does, it sort of hides everything to start. So where do you want to, rather than showing all the rows. So we'll start here with view hide section 1, which is the basic income and expense. So like the one before, the first 36 or so rows are identical. It is simply starting off with the number of units at the property, the weighted average bedroom, the contract rents, and then it gives you the gross and effective income, the operating expenses. Again, you can go in at any one of these cells and change these assumptions if you want. If you felt the operating costs rather than 4,364, you cut them too much, you wanted to bring it back up to 4,500, you can just go right in there and enter that value right there and whatnot. So it runs and it gives you the maximum supported first mortgage on the row 35 based on all the assumptions you used and how much replacement reserves you'd actually build up over a 20-year period based on that $500 assumption per unit per year. So that gives you, that's section 1. That tells you the maximum supportable first mortgage, and it tells you your 20-year replacement reserve. Section 2 will sort of show what's happening there. This is really just repeating back to you a lot of your assumptions. This section is really used to just affirm what you think you put in, but also if you decide to change some of the assumptions for one project but not for the other. So if you wanted to do loan to value or PBV at one project and not do it at the other, you can do it individually. So this allows you to sort of change the what-if scenarios project by project. We'll go down further. Summarizes the key business terms again, tells you the unit counts for the project as represented in PIC. Here's where if you're going to change the bedroom distribution for a particular property, and today you have 31 bedrooms at the property, and let's say under RAD you decide to change that to 32 bedrooms, let's take out the 31s, and you do the 32s, you'll note that actually the RAD contract rent, the form will have automatically modified the contract rents. If you go up where the rents are up above, they've gone up to 634. I forget what it was before. It was like 5 something. And so that's because under RAD, when you change, which you're free and fully allowed to change bedroom distributions, and generally the more larger bedroom units you have, the more funding you get, the more you drop the average bedroom distribution, the lower the funding. And the rationale behind that is under RAD, what we're really modeling is not exactly what you get today. It's really we're modeling what you would have gotten today with that bedroom distribution had it been in effect. Because you are able to, in public housing, change bedroom distribution. So this does that calculation for you. Leanne, let's go back to the original 30. Okay, so now that's that section. And then section 70 or section 3 is really it doesn't change from the previous. This is the section that tells you what your current funding is and what your rent caps are. So all that really hasn't changed from from the previous is background information if you want to know where some of these numbers came from. So we'll skip through that. And then, this is again all stuff that's already sort of in the existing tool. So the last two pieces that are sort of we've made the most revisions to is a build out of the sources and uses budget. So what this does is it automatically gives you a filled out sources and uses budget based on all the assumptions. So the sources are, starting off with the only thing you've identified is it's going to take out a loan of $470,000, and so that shows the loan. You've not identified anything else yet. You could go in here and say I'm going to put in some operating reserves or some capital funds to build into it, but at this moment we haven't. So we'll scroll down, so the total sources should be just that. And then the uses are, as we go through here, there was the hard cost of $634, but then the model includes various assumptions on financing fees, soft costs, the breakout of non-qualified uses. That's really when you get to tax credits, breaking out what can be included in the basis and what can't, and whether there's any replacement reserves. And so these reserves right here, that is the initial deposit replacement reserve. If you're not doing a tax credit, it's just simply saying that likely if it's an FHA loan, they're going to require you to do $500 per unit for an initial deposit replacement reserve to start off with some cushion. So in this particular project, where we started off with, if you go back to the global inputs page, and where it needed $18,000 a unit in hard costs, if all those is what we felt we built out, then we would go back to the inventory tab and we look at the results. What it's saying is it's still some $300,000 off. But this project, if it needs $18,000 a unit, it still needs to fill a gap of $277,000. Now, it could fill that gap by putting in some operating reserves or unspent capital funds, or who knows where else might get it. But that's sort of a beginning assumption. And again, you change whatever other assumptions are there. So so that is the sort of a simple, I'm not doing tax credit model, and it's sort of how the sort of the tool gives you an initial sources and uses that you can begin to play with. What I want to do next is just show you what this tool does now in terms of revisions to if you've got a tax credit project. So let's go back to the global inputs, and let's restore the global defaults. So we're going to go back to the original defaults, and now we're going to enter a new PHA. Jay, do you have a PHA you want to use yet?
Yeah, let's use CA014.
CA014. Okay, which is that.
Incidentally, you can type it in as well. You don't have to scroll through and select it. But
great, thanks, Jay. So we've clicked it. That's our San Mateo with the Housing Authority, and we'll populate the data. So we'll click on Populate Data to the right. And now it does it. Now, by the way, one of the things that this tool does that Jay and the team's been able to build in is that previously it was very hard to use this tool after you engaged it once if you wanted to pick up another agency. So we've been a little bit more, built more capability into it that you don't always have to sort of save and go out. It doesn't always work if you engage a very large PHA. The computer gets fussy, and the tool gets fussy, but if you've got a reasonably smaller or medium-sized agency, that you can keep using this to re-engage and enter new PHAs. So here we got San Mateo. Let's assume these assumptions are, so far, we don't need to change any of those. The hard costs, let's also assume, Jay, you want to keep 18 or you want to do higher?
Let's do 25.
Okay, we'll say it needs $25,000 in hard costs, which most of you familiar with RAD now know. You almost never can get there with first mortgage, not with the current funding we have today. Let's assume this assumption of $1,500 in relocation costs are what they are. The relocation cost is really can be a sort of a longer subject about when you think you need to pay for relocation costs, when the existing rehab assistance payments are sufficient to do it, and whatnot. But for today, let's just assume that you are having to pay some relocation to move the people out to do the work. And now, rather than doing no tax credits, let's do yes tax credits. And then, Jay, you want to sort of explain the assumptions on 37 to 43?
Sure, and there's notations on the side of all of them, too. You just hover over those arrows. So, but we start with the tax credit pricing assumption. this variable can range anywhere from 0.98 to 0.80, and it's the factor that goes into the pricing of the tax credits. So in your rural areas across the center of the country, it's going to be a 0.8. I was talking with somebody about a project in North Dakota they're doing right now, and it's a 0.8. In your urban areas, it tends to be a little bit higher. It has to do with the saleability of the tax credits. So it can get up as high as a 0.98 in New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco. So we start with a base assumption of 0.9. Then you have the selection of whether or not it's you're going to go with the 4 or 9% bonds. The 4% are generally more widely available. However, there are the 4% deals are sometimes a little harder to get done. There's a sweet spot for 4% deals. 9% deals are sometimes a little bit harder to come by because there's an approval from the state required for that, and a limited source of them, limited pool. Current rate for LIHTC 4% bonds. Currently, they're running at 3.24. This changes frequently, so it's a good idea to check with your lender on what the current rate is. We put in the current rate for the 9% is still the full 9%. We put in a variable there because there's no guarantees that it's going to always stay at the full 9%, but as of now, it's currently at the full 9%. The percentage of value allocated to the building. This is important because in a LIHTC deal, you're actually transferring the property and doing a long-term lease typically, but transferring the property to a separate entity, an LLC. That's for the purposes of being able to do the tax credits, and we have to determine what valuation we're going to use for that. So we typically use in this model we use a cap rate valuation, and this assumes that when we do a cap rate valuation of the property, that 85% of that is allocated to the building and structure, 15% of that is allocated to the land. So that's how we come up with that number. Developer fee percentage of cost. This is just according to what the regs will allow. They will allow up to a 15, but in many cases the states have tighter stipulations on that, and will only allow a 12. So we're modeling a 12% developer fee, and then the developer fee, if there's a gap, the developer fee is allowed to be deferred, and up to 50% of it can be deferred. The model will only use it if it needs it, so it doesn't automatically defer the 50% if there's a surplus, but it's there to calculate the 50% if it needs it. So those are the global variables, and we have the opportunity to change them here, and we can also make some adjustments to them on a property by property basis in the inventory overview tab.
So let's go to the inventory tab. Let's go to the first section, and again, remembering this is a tax credit example. So these in San Mateo, you have these two projects. The rents are certainly higher than they were in Wyoming, so the mid 700s, and so you've got much larger gross potential rents, and so when you get down to row 35, what you're doing is you are sort of being able to generate sort of what might be a loan of $3.3 million or 22,000 a unit on the first project, a little bit less on the second project. There's a little bit of flag there which says the debt service coverage ratio, loan requirements in future years checked. That's because it depends on sort of what assumptions you or your lender might be using for trending operating expenses and rent. And I think the model sort of starts with assuming those two are going to trend at the same rate because they're getting an OCAF. And that's generally fine when you're doing just a straight non-tax credit deal with a lender. For doing tax credits, most states don't allow you to use the same, even though you're getting an OCAF, it's supposed to be representing an increase in rents that track inflation. Often the states still require you to use a 2% operating cost inflation factor and a 3% rental inflation factor. So this is saying, you may want to go down in the model. We'll show you later, so how you can change it to do a 2 and 3. But I think it starts off with 2 and 2. And so, all right, so we're able to, with straight debt, generate $3.3 million. Let's skip over Section 2 and Section 3. We'll go to Section build out sources and uses. And so we have this project where we're able to generate, sort of starting off, $3.3 million in the first mortgage, although, again, check the trending stuff. But you'll see that there's an entry here for the value of low-income housing tax credit. So the model has gone through all the assumptions that it sort of has built in to figure out what the equity you could raise from the low-income housing tax credits. And then it's also making assumptions about seller take-back financing and deferred developer fee. We'll come back to that in just a second. So its sources are 9.8 or 9.9 million, and the uses. So Jay, you want to walk them through the uses here?
Sure. So the acquisition of the building, and the reason we break them into qualified and non-qualified uses is these are the items that go into the basis for calculating the tax credits. So qualified uses means they're part of the basis. And so the uses, the acquisition, that's what we were talking about earlier, the calculation at 85%, and you will also see the seller carryback financing. So typically what in these RAD deals, and we are able to carry back 100% of that as a seller note. So it really has a net effect on the funds needed, but it does go into the entire calculation. Construction cost is just taking our per unit estimate of cost times the number of units. Construction interest and fees. This is for during the construction phase. In a RAD deal, they typically run it in phases. So there is a construction phase and then a closing phase. So this is during the construction phase, the interest and fees associated with that. Financing fees, and we'll see all these down in the lower section. You'll see what some of these fees are. Financing fees, again, that's any legal, title, any of those fees associated with the financing. Your relocation costs, this is where we're coming into that, to that $1,500 a unit estimate that we had on the global page. You can override that again on the global page. We don't have the ability to override it here, but you can override it on a per unit basis in the global page. Soft costs, there's a list of soft costs in the section below. This includes your architect and appraisal fee, other financing fees, and other associated. There's a contingency built in there. Legal counsel, all those are included in the notations there. So, and then our developer fee, which is again that calculation straight on the 12%. 12% of the total development cost is attributed to the developer fee, and we'll see. So we're showing $1,069,000. It's deferring because we have a gap. It's deferring 50% of that. So if you recall up top, there was a deferred developer fee of probably just over $500,000, which would represent $534,000. That represents 50% of that fee being deferred. Then we get into the non-qualified uses, the acquisition land. This is zeroed out because typically we take that 85% and then we execute a long-term land lease, but the land is typically not transferred in these deals. That's the way they're typically structured. Financing fees, again, these are the non-qualified financing fees. So we had financing fees up top that were qualified, financing fees down below that are not. Just has to do with the way the tax credits are structured and what's a qualified expense and what's not. Tax credit fees are typically 1% of the tax credits, and that's just a formula calculation. And then reserves. Now, in the LIDIC deals, we're seeing an operating reserve and a debt service reserve of 6 months of operating expenses and 6 months of debt service. that they want to see funded in the reserves at closing. So that's what this represents. As opposed to when we just did a straight debt deal, we're only initially funding the replacement reserve at $500 a unit. So now this reserves is including the replacement reserve, the operating reserve, and the debt service reserve. So while it looks like a lot of additional expenses, this is really not an expense. It is just a use of funds at closing, which means you just have to have the money available at closing to be able to make it balance. Pay off outstanding debt is included there. We don't have any formula involved there because we don't know, if there is any outstanding debt. But if there is, you can enter it there in the green cell.
So in this particular case, thanks, Jay. Here was a project that wasn't able to meet all of its first mortgage, all of its needs through first mortgage proceeds, but by converting to 4% credits, was essentially able to fill the gap. It's within $100,000 right now of it, and so there's a sort of a larger sort of disclaimer or warning with this, which is generally the 4% tax credit program is really helpful in filling a gap, particularly when the RAD rents are not particularly low. So therefore, you've got some additional NOI that you can work with, and the project is not tiny. So if we went back to that Berkeley, Wyoming, or whatever that first project that we did, if a unit that's 50 units in a very low rent market, that 4% tax credit deal, just the transaction costs alone can be so high that it actually, you'll find if you did the model, you'll find out you're in a worse situation. It actually, to your detriment to try to do 4% credit just because of that. So, but anyway, again, these are all just intended as a planning aid. Certainly these are beginning assumptions for all these. They are sort of based on some experience, but there's only a limit to how much you can do with sort of global assumptions that every market's a little bit different, every project's different, and sizes of projects is really important for determining fees and whatnot. So it gets you in the ballpark, but we strongly encourage you to sort of work with, particularly when you're doing tax credits, appropriate sort of legal and consulting sort of professional expertise to sort of guide you in the right way. But at least this can sort of start you off on the right path. We won't go through the last set of assumptions in the construction budget there, but we do have sort of all the backup for a lot of these lines. And just show it. You can see sort of how these numbers came up with, and it's just again more embedded assumptions in the formula about where we come up with what the contingency was, or what some appraisal fee is, or things like that. So.
Greg, if I could add one other comment is, what we've seen, if you go back up to the sources side.
Sure.
I mean, there's no way to create formulas to know these things, but almost every deal that's done has some type of, some additional sources of funding.
Right.
Whether it's your operating fund reserves or, I mean, many of these properties have $300,000-400,000 in their operating fund reserves that's going to get replenished because you see it down there on the uses side. So you're not losing the money by creating it as a source, but if you have it in there, I mean, it's perfectly acceptable to plug it in there as a contribution on the uses on the sources side.
Right.
Right. Capital fund, replacement housing factor. I mean, all of these are sources of funds that we've seen done in these LIDIC deals. And there's just no way to formula enter what they are. So we created the spaces for you to identify, where there's a potential gap, and these are some potential sources of additional funding, and
yep.
And it's perfectly customary and acceptable that you're going to find one or more of those to make your deal work.
Great, thanks, Jay. And there's one other item I wanted to say with this. That the lines, sorry, Leanne, I go down to where the tax credit's like 184, something like that, 183, so the value line of the tax credit. The other modification to this tool is that previously what we were quoting on this line was sort of the net equity raised. We sort of backed out the sort of the fees that would be associated with raising this. But in this model, just trying to make it a little bit more precise, this is actually, yes, what we think you could raise for it, but if we also show all the cost of in the uses. So that's sort of a refinement here. So again, this is helpful for people who not done tax credits before and want to get a sense of the ballpark and what sort of some different fees are and whatnot. But again, please also seek appropriate sort of advice whenever you're sort of pursuing tax credit. So, all right, we wanted to sort of share that with you today and give you a quick overview of this revised inventory assessment tool and just sort of a little more souped up from the one we've done before. And so that's it. We have nothing else planned, but we see that some PHAs have already sort of, or some people would like to ask them questions, so we'll now go to the Q&A period. Do we have any hands raised first, Leah? Okay, Jim Walker. Hello, Jim.
Hello. I just, going back to the tool for just a second.
Sure.
For the slow of foot here, could you, in the assumptions now when we're doing the tax credit or there's the capitalization rate, could someone just say again what that is and how that plays into the calculation?
Jay, you want to handle that?
Yeah, you bet. So the capitalization rate is used in two places. But it's basically used to create a value. So the formula is to take our net operating income and divide it by the capitalization rate. So it's an arbitrary sort of number used by the industry to measure value. And we start with the base assumption of 7. A lower cap rate indicates a lower risk property. So if you have a property with historically, 0 vacancy for the past 15 years, that's going to be a lower risk property deemed by the market. And so therefore, you might have a cap rate that's a little bit lower, indicating a higher value. So that's how the cap rate is used. It's used with the loan to value because we have to come up with a valuation in order to do the loan to value calculation. So in this example,
yep.
So in this example, the 7% creates a certain value. Then our maximum loan is 87% of that value. That's how the loan to value calculation is done.
Okay, that's it. So if you're doing a loan to value in terms of a loan based on that, if you're using it for tax credit purposes, and it may be a D4, so you may be using still debt service coverage ratio for purposes of sizing the loan, but also what this is important for is it's deciding sort of when you sell the property, the housing authority sells the property to the partnership, and then so it does take back financing. This cap rate in this here is deciding what is the value of the asset. Is it going to be 15,000 a unit, 20, 30,000 a unit, and it's saying the value of the asset which you could sell it for is based on the cap rate of, in this case, 7%. And that's telling you how much the property could sell for when you do this seller take-back financing in order to create more sort of equity you can raise under the tax credit program.
Correct.
All right, so we've got someone we can hear someone's background talking, so if you could just, so maybe Jim, maybe it's from your side. Maybe there's a couple people from your side.
No, I'm sorry, that's me. Lisa had to take a call, and I got it on
okay, no problem.
here. So.
Okay, sorry, Jay. So Jim, I know that was pretty quick. That do you want a follow-up? And I'm also happy to talk to you, this week as you want to make some time.
Great, but that got me at least to where I
okay.
understand what it's there for.
All right, thanks, Jim. Let's see who else we've got that's raised their hand. No more hands. All right, so right now we've got some written questions. So a written question is, how do you account for unfunded pension costs that are not booked until 2015 or 16, and other facts such as utility costs going up 200% in the next 3 years? Okay, so let's first talk about the unfunded pension. So Wow, you're asking the wrong person. No. So the first is I would have discussions with your auditor, right, to find out sort of for this unfunded pensions and whether that needs to be built into the cost of just like a outstanding EPC loan or a CFFP loan. Is that a liability that transfers over to the project? And I apologize that I'm not an accountant, so I can't answer that question, but I would seek their advice about to do it. But in terms of utility costs going up to your expected 200% in the next 3 years, so you're going to get an OCAP under RAD, and that OCAP is based on what's happening in operating expenses in that market, and it's based on the 8 or 10 Bureau of Labor Statistics particular indices that they look at, and the indices are sort of wage rates and cost of insurance and property taxes, and one of those line items is insurance, and that they pull that out of the BLI, and they do a composite based on the percentage of typical costs in a property of what those items represent as sort of a basket of goods. And so it won't work itself through the wash in year one, but theoretically that should catch up to you. That the OCAP in your market should represent what's happening in cost in your market. So as utility costs go up, theoretically then OCAP should go up. And that's true also in the public housing program, because the utility adjustment factor we give you is also based on essentially a BLI index of and then weighted for what percentage of the cost of the public housing program are for utilities. So I can't, I can't guarantee you that it's going to be as precise because it's a statistical model, but in theory it should work itself over time that the OCAP is picking up what's happening in the local market. Okay, next audio or written questions. Who we got? Jim, you got another follow-up question? Jim, we've got you listed as raising.
Oh, yeah. No, I do have a completely different question.
Okay.
Once someone submitted their application and/or once the initial application is approved, on things like, they're sending in capital fund budgets now and that sort of thing, what world are they in? Are they in public housing until they close?
They are in public housing until they close, or actually until the HAP is effective. So the closing date usually is in the middle of the month, and I guess that's called the dry closing, and the wet closing, the term I've heard, is the actual effective date of that new HAP contract. So if I have the closing on November 15th, the HAP is effective December 1st, and that's the day you are out of the public housing program for that project.
But up until then, all the public housing rules all apply.
Yep. Except we've done, some things like, well, you won't be, as long as you've gotten the CHAP, you're not scored under FAS, but otherwise, you're living by public housing procurement rules, and if you're using public housing funds, you're subject to public housing program until you're converted.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure. Okay. We don't have any other questions. Any other oral questions or audio questions? Let's see if there's any more written. No, that's it. A quiet group today. Okay. All right. Okay. I think that will end our call for today. Thanks everybody for participating in the call. Jay, let's just hang on the line for you and I for just a sec. I just want to talk about that relocation one. I wonder if we should have made a change there, all right?
Sure.
Okay. Thanks.